night was cold enough to sting, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question every decision that led you outside. At a dimly lit bus stop on the edge of the city, a man with nothing left to give made a choice that would change two lives forever. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. And he certainly didn't know that the woman shivering beside him controlled a company worth millions. He only knew one thing. She was cold, and he had a jacket. What happened next is not just a story. It's a reminder of who we become when no one is watching. Backhand index pointing right before the story unfolds. Take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Awakened Wisdom, because stories like this don't just entertain. They awaken something within us. The bus stop sat between a closed convenience store and a flickering street lamp, its glass panels smudged with fingerprints and rain marks from better days. Daniel pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his chest, though it did little to stop the wind that sliced through the fabric as if it were paper. He had lost count of how many nights he'd waited for that bus, sometimes to get home, sometimes just to feel like he was still moving somewhere. That evening, the city felt especially indifferent. Cars rushed past without slowing, their headlights briefly illuminating the tired lines on his face before disappearing into the dark. Daniel noticed her almost by accident. She stood a few feet away, heels planted awkwardly on the cracked pavement, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She wore a thin coat, elegant, but clearly not meant for weather like this. Her hair, perfectly styled earlier in the day, had begun to unravel, strands clinging to her cheeks as she shivered. She tried to hide it, straightening her posture whenever someone passed, as if pride alone could keep her warm. Daniel looked away at first. He had learned not to stare. Life had taught him that everyone carried their own burdens, and he had enough of his own to manage. But the wind howled again, sharper this time, and he heard her inhale sharply, a small, involuntary sound that betrayed her struggle. Something twisted in his chest. He thought of his mother, long gone now, who used to say that kindness didn't require wealth, only awareness. He hesitated. The jacket he wore was all he had that kept him warm. Without it, the night would be brutal. He imagined the long ride home, the cold seats, the walk from the bus stop to his small apartment where the heating barely worked. Logic told him to stay still, to mind his own business. But another voice, quieter and more persistent, told him that if he ignored her, he'd carry that choice longer than he'd carry the cold. Slowly, almost awkwardly, Daniel stepped closer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She looked up, startled, her eyes sharp and guarded at first. He noticed they were tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much responsibility and not enough rest. "You look freezing," he continued. "You can take my jacket." For a moment, she just stared at him, confusion flickering across her face. "Oh no, I couldn't," she replied quickly. "You need it." Her voice was calm, polished, the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms and negotiations, though Daniel couldn't have known that. He only saw a woman trying to maintain dignity in the cold. Daniel shrugged and slipped the jacket off anyway, holding it out to her. "I'll be fine," he lied gently. "It's warmer on the bus." The lie tasted bitter, but he forced a small smile. She hesitated again, then finally accepted it, wrapping it around her shoulders. The jacket was too big, hanging loosely on her frame, but the warmth brought immediate relief. She exhaled, a long breath she'd been holding in for too long. "Thank you," she said softly, and this time her eyes softened. "You didn't have to do that." "Sometimes," Daniel replied, "we do things because we can." The words surprised even him. He hadn't realized he believed them so deeply. They stood in silence after that, the wind still biting, but something between them had shifted. When the bus finally arrived, its brakes screeching as it pulled up, they boarded together. Daniel took a seat near the back, while she sat across from him, still clutching the jacket. He looked out the window, watching the city blur by, and wondered briefly who she was and where she was going. But he didn't ask. Some kindness, he believed, didn't need an explanation. When she stood to get off several stops later, she paused beside him. "I'll return this," she said, holding out the jacket. Daniel shook his head. "Keep it," he replied. "At least until you're somewhere warm." She nodded, something unreadable crossing her face. "Then, I hope we meet again," she said. And with that, she stepped off the bus and disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel colder, but strangely lighter than before. Daniel didn't think much of the encounter in the days that followed. Life moved on the way it always did, slowly, relentlessly. He worked his shifts at the warehouse, ate simple meals, and tried not to dwell on what he didn't have. The memory of that night occasionally surfaced, especially when the cold returned, but he dismissed it as just another fleeting moment in a long line of forgotten ones. Kindness, he believed, wasn't an investment. You gave it without expecting anything back. 2 weeks later, Daniel was called into his supervisor's office. The warehouse hummed outside, forklifts beeping, boxes sliding along conveyors. Inside, however, the air felt heavy. His supervisor looked unusually nervous, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. "Daniel," he said, "there's someone here to see you." When the door opened, Daniel's breath caught. She stood there, composed and confident, wearing a tailored coat that spoke of power and precision. Her hair was flawless, her posture commanding, but her eyes, he recognized them instantly. They were the same tired eyes from the bus stop, now brighter, steadier. She smiled when she saw him. "Hello, Daniel," she said, as if they were old friends. Confusion flooded him. Do I know you?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "You offered me your jacket," she said gently, "on a cold night when you had every reason not to." She turned to the supervisor. "If you don't mind, I'd like a few minutes alone with him." They stepped outside, into the quiet of the loading bay. "My name is Aliner," she continued. "I'm the CEO of the company that owns this warehouse." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. CEO. The word echoed in his mind, colliding with every assumption he'd made. He looked at her jacket, his jacket, now cleaned, folded neatly over her arm. I've spent my life surrounded by people who give because they expect something in return, Alina said. That night, I was exhausted. A deal had fallen apart, my car broke down, and for the first time in years, I felt invisible. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't care what I did. You just saw a person who was cold. She handed him the jacket. I wanted to thank you, she said, not with money or empty words, but with opportunity. Over the next few minutes, she explained her plan: new training programs, leadership roles, a chance for Daniel to move beyond survival and into stability. She offered mentorship, education, and a position that recognized not just his work ethic, but his character. Daniel listened, stunned. He thought of all the nights he'd felt unseen, all the moments he'd questioned his worth. Why me? He finally asked. Alina smiled. Because companies don't just need smart people, she replied. They need good ones. Months later, Daniel stood in a suit that still felt unfamiliar, looking out over the same city that once rushed past him without notice. His life hadn't changed overnight, but it had changed deeply. He still rode the bus sometimes, still noticed the people others overlooked. And Alina, despite her power, never forgot the night she learned that true wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in humanity. Backhand index pointing right if this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of a single kind act. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Awakened Wisdom, because every story we share is a step toward becoming more aware, more compassionate, and more awake.